Hello and welcome to this interview as part of Restaurant and Bar Design Week. I'm Harry McKinley and I'm joined by Martin Brudnizki, founder of the London-based Martin Brudnizki Design Studio. Launched in 2000, the studio employs over 70 people, mostly interior designers and architects, and has overseen some of the world's most iconic hospitality projects. It's for that reason that we won't be discussing just one project, but a medley, a kind of Martin Brudnizki's greatest hits, if you will. We'll explore how they've shaped and defined the studio, but also the wider restaurant and bar landscape. So, Martin, before we talk about some projects, let's start with your wider design sensibility. You're from Sweden originally, of course, and far be it from me to perpetuate national stereotypes, but I think it's fair to say that your work doesn't necessarily embody the quintessential Nordic aesthetic. It's plush, layered, even flamboyant at times. Did you always have a sense that you wanted to design against type? Did it, or does it, surprise you that some would even still have a preconceived notion of how a designer from Sweden would or should design?
Well, hi, Harry. So I'm Martin Brudnizki. Well, that's an interesting question. The fact is actually that I'm not really Swedish by origin because my mother is German, my father is Polish. So I grew up in some sort of little microcosm outside Stockholm. So that's why I think I've been able to sort of look at design in many different ways. And that's always been my way of doing it. I like to explore. I like to explore different themes. And I've always been interested in sort of finding out. And that's this sort of like sense of exploration has always been a big part of the work that I do.
I wanted to get that out of the way first for those listening, to be clear that this isn't going to be a conversation about austere functionality or minimalism. And to prove that point, let's talk about Scott's, a seafood restaurant in London and one of your signature projects from 2006. Why did this one jump out when it came to considering projects that have most defined your journey as a designer and the journey of the studio?
You know, it's interesting if you just take one step back. You know, the projects we're going to talk about today are sort of the three sort of seminal projects that sort of changed the public's perception of what I do, which is sort of interesting. And Scott's was really the first sort of high-end hospitality restaurant project that I sort of did. And it was an interesting journey because Scott's is the second oldest restaurant in London. And it had to be rejuvenated or reinvented, and so I wanted to give that sort of old world patina in a very contemporary way, and that was sort of the approach, with a lot of interesting detail like the scallop mosaic around the bar, and then of course the interesting collaboration with Amanda Lavette, Future Systems. She did, you know, the crustacean plus the WC vanity units. All of this and the great art curated by Mark Hicks at the time in the restaurant, you know, just created this sort of a sense of a modern British restaurant, but still looked back to its past of being the second oldest restaurant.
And how did that project come about?
Well, Scott's is owned by Caprice Holdings, and Caprice Holdings was part of Belga Group at the time, and I sort of worked with them a lot. And then Richard Caring bought Belga Group, because I knew the guys at Caprice Holdings, so they approached me and asked me if I wanted to design it. And it was great. It was this sort of first high-end restaurant project I was doing on my own, or in my own name, so it was very exciting.
You just mentioned some of the specific design details, of course, but can you talk me through the wider design story there, and perhaps the original brief and how you responded to it?
Well, the brief was really a discussion, so it wasn't really like, we want you to do this. It was like, you know, it was a discussion and we sort of explored it together with the client and I, and we sort of just looked at a number of covers, how would it work. But I think what was very important is to create sort of like a social restaurant, hence the bar went in the center, it activates the space, so you have the sort of the bar dining, then you have the dining at the back of the restaurant, but the bar is sort of like the stage. From, you know, that you can almost see everywhere, wherever you sit in the room, which is sort of important.
What are some of the key design details? What should people pick up on or notice when they go into that space?
The key design details is the bar, the scallop mosaic skirt, as I call it, on the floor around the bar. You have as well the rugs in the room that were designed by Christine van der Hurd, which are really, really beautiful. And then it's really about the art. So we created this beautiful sort of what we call brown grey timber paneling with a brass detail in it, and then it's about the art that sits on that, which is sort of very important. All of these layers that sort of create this atmosphere, traditional, modern look.
Although the studio was established 6 years prior, it's still very much early Brudnizki. Do you feel a sense of your own evolution as a designer when you look back at that project today?
Yes, it was the start, and it was where I explored the idea of modernism and classicism in an interior, and as well sort of looking at it from sort of a minimal standpoint of view, even though it's not like cleanly minimal, but it's, if you remove the finishes, it's a very clear diagram, as I call it. And if you remove the finishes from any of my projects, even like projects like Annabel's, there is a clear diagram to the elevations, to the floor plan, the furniture layout, which is sort of, it's something that stayed with me and that hasn't really changed in Scott's, but it's just how we have decorated it that's changed, like what I call the narrative of the spaces that we create.
Would you do it the same way today?
Probably not. We probably would look at a slightly different narrative because the world has moved on since 2006, and we probably would be a little bit more playful.
It is an interesting point then about how hospitality has changed from 2006 until now. How would you describe that change, and how do you think that's reflected in the wider restaurant design landscape?
We enjoy them the same way as we did before. However, it's sort of, you want value for your money when you go out. And I think you need to sort of create this experience. As a restaurateur, you need to create an experience when people come in to the restaurant that just beyond the food, perhaps, is more than just the food. And the interior plays a big, big part of that more than ever. But that saying, I don't think you can interior design a successful restaurant. The food, the service is the base of it and has to be very good. And then the interior design is there just to support that action. And that's very, very important. But I think it sort of comes back to creating a very strong narrative for the brand that you're trying to support.
As the first luxury restaurant project under the Martin Brudnizki name, it must have come with some new challenges also. What were those and how did you overcome them?
Oh, the neighbors. I mean, if you can design a restaurant, you can design anything, because doing a restaurant is very, very complicated. But you have to remember, before I did Scott's, I did design a lot of like high street restaurants like Strada, etc., etc. So I did know how to design a restaurant. I did understand the whole idea of how to make it work. So I did know how to do that. I had sort of started exploring the whole thing about activation in space, how you activate space through different like bars or kitchens that I opened. So I was well aware of that. But this project was interesting because of the neighbors. But it is just like how to deal with the neighbors to make sure that they're happy. And I learned a lot from that because of that, there were a lot of other technical issues we had to resolve. So that was the challenge. So Scott's has like 2 boreholes. So basically the air conditioning system is cooled from the groundwater that gets pumped up and cools it. So there's no sort of extraction out into the street. And then as well how we sort of did the sort of sound insulation of the space. So I learned a lot from it. So that was sort of very interesting. And as well, Scott sort of became almost like with the council, like this sort of interesting pilot project. And now everyone has to do what we did in terms of isolating sound towards your neighbors, etc. So it was interesting. So I learned lots from it, on that more technical aspect.
But even at that point, you had worked relatively extensively in residential design. So I'm wondering what you brought from that into the design of the restaurant space, just in terms of making it welcoming and a space that's comfortable to be in.
But that's what we've always done. Our hospitality projects are very residential in approach. It's very important that when you walk in, you should feel like you're at home. It's sort of important. The only thing, like with time and experience that are sort of adding to it, is becoming more about an emotion that we want the sort of people to feel as they enter into the space. So that become a big part of the design process. How do we, through design, can create that emotion, that people feel a certain way? The sort of psychology of it, which I find fascinating. And that's sort of something that drives me and that I'm very interested in. The sort of idea of this, creating this emotion, creating that sort of sense of fantasy, because I think that's sort of what we all want, the escape.
How did Scott's ultimately represent a turning point for the studio? Did it bring more attention your way? Did people approach you for new kinds of projects off the back of what you did at that restaurant?
Yes, they did, but it was usually they wanted something similar. So that's sort of what happens. When you do something that is a project that gets a lot of recognition, people approach you to do something similar. That is sort of how I think most people think. So yes, we got a lot of attention for it, and it was sort of great. We sort of proved the fact that we actually could do this sort of high-end hospitality project, which was great.
Let's move on to Soho Beach House, Miami. 4 years after Scott's, but a world apart in terms of concept and brief. How were you approached to take that one on?
Basically, Nick Jones was a business partner of Richard Carey. I worked on Chiconis in West Hollywood with Nick and with Richard, and once that was completed, they were very happy with it. So then Nick asked me to help him out with Soho Beach House Miami, and again that was as well a very exciting project. You know, how do you take the idea of sort of Soho House? How do you take the idea of that sort of colonial style and make it sort of Miami, sort of taking influences from like Cuba, etc., to make it sort of more local? So it was a very exciting project, and it garnered us an enormous amount of attention in America, still to this day, which is fascinating.
Soho Beach House Miami is the second in what's a trifecta of projects that we're here talking about today. How did that project, perhaps more than some others, represent a milestone or a turning point for the studio and for you as a designer?
Because we sort of did the whole club. We did the rooms, we did the restaurants, we did the spa. It just showed that we could deal with every aspect of a hospitality project, which is sort of a club, a hotel, has a spa, has this, that, and the other. So it was fascinating how we could actually make something that was about Soho House, a very British sort of club, feel at the same time very American and Miami.
Did you feel that a sense of trust had been put in you by the owners who essentially are saying, we know that you can do restaurants, but let's give you a free rein to do all of these other things as well?
Yes, not so expressly they said that, but it's like that they knew that I would do a good job with it. And, and it was very important because like all of these big projects abroad has always huge challenges. Me and my team, they knew we were sort of a safe pair of hands to make it happen, to pull it together, and that's sort of what was needed. And at the same time, give it that very distinctive look that it needed to be special and successful.
You talk about this British brand being dropped down in the middle of Miami. So what is the design story there, and what are some of the key design details?
So I think we sort of took the idea of sort of the Britishness of with the sort of slight sort of colonial influences, and then we sort of went to Cuba and we looked at the colors, the sort of concrete tile patterns that they do. So we took a lot of inspiration from that, but then sort of made it modern, used very modern, very strong colors, and as well very important, like to infuse the sense what Soho House is about into that, and to create something that felt young, fresh, and fun. And it was a great project, so that was a lot of exploration. We had to do it very quickly as well because the project had been going on for quite a few years before I joined, so we needed to try to get it to finish.
So whether it's Scott's or Soho Beach House Miami, how much do you think about who the guest of these properties is, and how much is the design tailored to them?
There is a different guest, but at the same time there is the same guest as well. So people that go to Scott's would go to Soho Beach House in Miami. So because it's just fun. And when I've stayed there often, and it's just always a great place to come back to and really, really enjoy it because of the different people that go. And that's the great thing with Soho House. It has this sort of interesting cross-section of society that goes and stays, uses the club. So it's always fascinating. So you have from young to old, which I really enjoy. The only thing, the common denominator is that it is creative. The people are creative because that's the membership and that's the people that enjoy staying there.
Do you prefer to keep all aspects of the realization of a design within the studio, or do you work with local creatives, craftspeople, artists and the like?
We always work with local craftspeople if we can find them, but we work with people all over the world that are great at creating things, and I always say without their skill we will be nothing. They're going to interpret and sort of create these beautiful pieces that we have designed. So it's so important. As I said, we're nothing without them.
Let's change direction then slightly, Martin. We've spoken before about emulation, and it's something that's brought up frequently with your work. That idea that it's inspired other designers or that your own approach and aesthetic has resonated across the restaurant and bar landscape. I also know that it's not something you give too much consideration to, so I thought I'd put it a different way. Is there ever true originality in design, or is it always fundamentally referential? Is it ever really possible to do something new, or is it always a case of drawing on what's come before and spinning that in a slightly alternative way?
I think it's very difficult to create something that is new because most things has been done before. The references you use is like, how do you put it together? And that is what's going to be new. How you layer it, how you stack it, how you mash it. That is what's going to create something that people will have a sense that it's something new. So I think most things have done before, but it's depending on how clever you are in creating this new mix.
Do you ever consciously pick up on some of those Brudnizki-isms in other people's work?
Very seldom do I see people that sort of copy exactly what we do. I mean, people hopefully, which I sort of see as flattery, get inspired and they do their own version of it. So great, good on them. But sometimes I can see certain designers, it's sort of like the sort of what I call the sort of matrix, the grid of the design is very similar to what we do. You know, like the lamps on the bar, the this, the that, even though I did not invent it. I was inspired by that too at some stage, actually from America, because that's where I sort of saw it the first time many years ago. And it's actually been around for decades. So, but I do see it sometimes, how the sort of the matrix, how we design a restaurant in other people's work. But I take it as flattery. It doesn't annoy me or, because, I know it creates a good room.
If you were for a moment to acknowledge that other designers are inspired by your work, what is it that you hope they would be most inspired by? What are some of those sensibilities or elements that you imbue in your work that you hope that they would draw from?
How you light a hospitality space and color. Those two things, I think, is what people will sort of take from what I do, because I think color is so important.
How so? Because from my vantage point, I think that you are much braver, perhaps, with color than might be true of some other designers.
Yeah. No, it's sort of something I've always done, and I guess getting a little bit wilder as I get older. Color is very important. I remember sort of very distinctly when I came to study in London many years ago, and one of the first sort of courses I did was like color theory, and the teacher sort of said, one thing to remember is people are afraid of color. Remember that. So it's going to always be a struggle. And that's always been in the back of my mind. And I always love color. I think color is very important. So it's not that it's been a massive struggle for me to use it in my work, but it's something I think that I've always done and I will always do. And I always try to sort of, I wouldn't call it educated, but hopefully will give people a different point of view in the space that they have used. And I think that's what I'm hoping, that people will look at it to see how actually you can actually use color and do it and not to be afraid of it.
Annabel's, then, completed in 2018. For me, this is quintessential Brudnizki. The use of pattern, colour, the whimsy. I wonder if you feel the same way, that somehow this is a project that really speaks to your work in a fully formed, all-encompassing way.
It does do that, but that's sort of some people would call it the extreme version of it. I've always wanted to explore that side of my brain, to sort of do something that people call it maximalist. But, most clients will not let you do that because, it's not really been done for a long time. People like Renzo Mongiardino did it so well, during the 50s and 60s, etc. So since then, there's not really been that much around of it. So Richard Herring allowed me to go mad, and it was really great fun, and it gave me this opportunity just to explore this, and it was really fantastic. It was fun. As I was given a chance to explore maximalism through the work I did at Annabel's, I have in the past as well explored other areas like minimalism. I've looked at in the past, and I've looked as well things like modernism and classicism, and these are the four pillars, maximalism, minimalism, modernism, and classicism. I use them today when I do projects, because through the work I did at Annabel's, I sort of feel I've reached a balance as a designer. Still have lots to learn. We learn every day, but I now pick from these four pillars when I do a project. And it's quite interesting. I can build narratives sort of around them. At the moment, we're doing a restaurant in LA where I've basically taken the idea of Carlo Scarpa and mixing it in with some sort of very sort of rusticana type patterns of Italian sort of countryside, and I'm mixing it together that normally you wouldn't do, but it does work. And this is the whole thing. So this what I'm trying to break down is sort of the purity of like being minimalist, or the purity of being maximalist. I want to sort of like mix it together and see what happens.
It's lovely that you mentioned the Italian countryside, because I think one of the elements that's very present in your work is this country sensibility, whether it's the Italian countryside, the English countryside, yet reimagined perhaps for these urban environments. Is that something that you would agree with?
In a way, we're taking that sort of classical idea of furniture, armchairs, etc., and like how we do the fringing and tassels and trims, it's sort of become a really big thing. And I think that, even though through the years people have done that even for their houses in London, we do that a lot. And last year I moved into my little place in the country, and I have a very grand drawing room, and I've just gone absolutely mad, and it just has so many tassels and trims, but it's fun. I really got to do it for myself, which is fantastic.
You mentioned maximalism, you mentioned some of the specific design details, but talk us through the design story of Annabel's, because it is a very brazen, confident design with layer upon layer of detail and storytelling.
So the whole idea came from, I remember I was sitting down because it was just such a huge thing. We were turning Annabel's, which was a nightclub in a basement, into like a whole building, and it was like to be a day club, and a nightclub, and how would that work? And so I had to sort of revert to think about inspiration. Where do I start? So Richard Karen was very involved in the whole idea. So I sort of thought about taking inspiration from Richard, which is always sort of a good thing to start looking at your client. He's like a typical Englishman. He loves the countryside. He loves animals. He loves gardens. So I took all of these elements and we sort of made it a project about flora and fauna. So that are the two F's, basically. So it starts on the ground floor, which is basically about the idea of Englishness, and a rose garden with these beautiful murals painted of a beautiful parkland landscape. And out to the real terrace with all the greenery and the wacky upholstered furniture, etc. Then you sort of takes you upstairs where you're looking more on sort of Far Eastern Indian sort of landscape and gardens, and so that's sort of how it happened, came together. And then you go into the basement, which is sort of really about sort of paradise lost, the fall of man, because that always happens at the end of the night in a nightclub. So So that sort of was the story. So it was all built around flora and fauna. So that was the narrative, and we had so much fun with it, and it was amazing project.
Maybe an unexpected pivot, but let's talk about loos for a moment, because I often find that in restaurants there are forgotten detail, that people put all the emphasis and creativity on the dining room itself. In Annabel's, that is not the case. So do you think it's important for designers to bring the same creativity and storytelling to some of these peripheral spaces just as much as they do with the main dining rooms?
I think it's very important, because when you have a space that's so strong, you need to balance it. It's about this experience. You want to be immersed in this emotion as you enter into these spaces, and you want to have the experience when you walk into a new space. So I think it was sort of quite important. There was a lot of work for us, but I think it sort of became quite sort of important. And we do it for all our projects, even when we do something slightly simpler. We even put that much attention into the bathrooms, because there's the balance. The balance is what's important.
It's a great point, because a fantasy has been created at Annabel's in many ways, and it's wonderful that one can venture to any corner of that venue and not step out of the fantasy. How does it feel to revisit some of these previous projects, and what has been the biggest change in your design philosophy from Scott's in 2006 to today, 2021?
Well, the big change is that I'm a more well-rounded designer now. I have had so much more experience, and I've seen so much more. I travel so much more, and from that, I've sort of learned actually how to do it. The whole idea of the narrative, which is something I've taken years to develop, to think about how do you create a narrative for a space, and how do you make that work for the client and for yourself? So, you know, it's sort of, I think it's sort of great, as I sort of said, we never finish learning, but have got on the way to be a much better and more well-rounded designer.
Do you think you've become braver?
I've always been quite brave, but I think you're brave in what you sort of know and understand. And I think sometimes you have to push yourself out of your comfort zone. But with design, because it's an applied art, you know, it's like our clients really will guide what we sort of are allowed to do. So it's always about that sort of conversation with your client, and because at the end of the day, we create spaces for them, and we need to still work with them to achieve that. And certain clients are very brave, and certain clients want a certain thing that's perhaps simpler. But it's all about vision at the end of the day, and Richard Carey had vision with Annabel, and it sort of suited me right down to the T, because it's exactly what I wanted to do at the time.
As always, fantastic to chat to you, Martin, and thank you for joining us today. Those listening can find Martin Brudnizki Design Studio on Instagram at m_b_d_s_. Me on Instagram at Harry McKinley, and Restaurant and Bar Design Awards at Restaurant and Bar Design Awards. Do also check out our other talks, and you can find much more content on the website at www.restaurantandbardesignawards.com. But for now, thanks for listening.